Okay, I believe that we are live now. Sorry that we're a few minutes late, everyone. We just had some technical difficulties with our mics. My name is Eve Rickert. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the publisher for Thornapple Press, which is a Canadian publisher of books on love, relationships, and sexuality. And I am joining from the traditional unceded ancestral territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples. Also known as Victoria, British Columbia. And I'm excited to introduce Kayden Abley. I realized I didn't ask you in advance how to pronounce your name, so if I got it wrong, please do correct me.
It's actually Abley.
Abley? Okay, that's really embarrassing. I'm so sorry. Well, I'll let you introduce yourself and tell us your name and anything else you want to tell us.
Also, you actually got it right the first time I talked to you, so
really, okay.
You did, so that's fine. Okay. So I'm Kayden Abley. I'm joining you from the unceded traditional lands of the Algonquin people, colonially known as Ottawa. So we have quite the time difference and weather difference, I think, from there to here. And I wrote the little non-monogamy and death book.
Yes. What everyone here is coming to hear about.
And
it's a great little book.
Thank you.
Really useful and timely for a lot of people.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that. I kind of came to this in a very odd, roundabout fashion. As a child, I grew up watching lovely family films like A Little Princess and The Secret Garden and The Secret of Nim, all of which have to do with death as a subject. And as a child learning about this, it was fascinating and kind of terrifying, but definitely something to think about. And I ended up doing my master's thesis in Scotland on child death in Victorian Scotland and how parents cope with grief and around classism, regarding how different groups treated parents of children who had passed away. And then I ended up going to funeral school in Ontario to become a funeral director and embalmer, which I did not proceed with because I did not feel comfortable driving a limousine, which was part of the internship, was chauffeuring people and people who had passed away to funeral services. But I did complete all of the courses in anatomy, microbiology, embalming, funeral theory, embalming labs, and the funeral homes would send to school the problem cases so that we got the practice and the experience, and they knew that the cases were in good hands. So that was definitely an education, literally. Before I started funeral school, it did not occur to me that people didn't die like this.
Right.
So when I first went into that class, it was definitely an awakening.
Mm-hmm.
And
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, having done that, I ended up working in the kind of health service medical side of helping living people instead of people who have passed away. But as someone who does work in the home care sector, I do end up helping clients who have dealt with death. So there is an unofficial part of my education that has actually proven very useful in my current job. And it was fascinating to see the disconnect between the funeral services industry when I was in school and the people I know in my personal life who are non-monogamous, or, as a non-monogamous person myself, it was fascinating and slightly alarming to see how many people don't think about these somewhat controversial, but also necessary topics.
Yeah. So just going to pause for a moment and say we do have a few live watchers. So if you are watching this live and you want to say hi in the comments, just so we know who's here with us, that would be great. Because otherwise we just have the little eye that says, 6 people right now watching. And if you want to post questions in the comments, you can do that as well. But can you tell us a little bit more about this book? So this book is Non-Monogamy and Death. It's officially out in just a week or so, I think. And you can order it wherever you buy your books. And if you go to our website, thornapplepress.ca, there's a bunch of links to buy it at local bookstores and things like that. But can you tell us more about how this book came to be, why it exists, and what people might find inside?
So I ended up becoming involved because a friend of mine in Ottawa is Alyssa Gonzalez, who wrote the Non-Monogamy and Neurodivergence book, which is amazing, and I highly recommend to anybody, especially for people like myself who are also neurodivergent. And it's amazing how many of these topics don't get discussed in general life. And Alyssa mentioned that there was the idea coming around of discussing other topics within the realm of non-monogamy and things that topics that not only the general population doesn't discuss very much, such as neurodivergence or trauma or death or jealousy or teaching. Well, teaching, I guess, is discussed more often, but the rest of them aren't as much. And I thought I could maybe propose non-monogamy and death, considering my experience in the funeral industry and as a non-monogamous person. And it got accepted, and here I am. Thank you, Eve.
Yeah. Well, thank you for pitching it. And so can you tell us some high points of the book? What sorts of topics are covered in it? And in particular, what you see as some of the most important considerations for non-monogamous folks in thinking about and planning for death?
So I definitely can do that. I ended up sort of splitting the book into 2 sections, largely. One is planning for death before a death has occurred as a non-monogamous person or as someone who is involved with non-monogamy. And then the second part of the book is how to proceed after a death has occurred. And the first part of the book it's challenging because not only do people have to discuss death, they also have to kind of be aware of non-monogamy and its inherent concepts and practices. So, for example, if someone doesn't understand the topic of consent or having multiple partners in a consensual, caring way, it's going to be very challenging to discuss death and funerary practices as a whole, because in general, a lot of people, they understand if you say one of my parents passed away or one of my children. They don't necessarily understand if you say my metamor passed away or my, secondary partner passed away or my satellite or comet partner. The funeral industry is not particularly well set up to handle a lot of these concerns. I would hope that it is more aware now, and I know even funeral directors who might identify as non-monogamous, they might be challenged when it comes to figuring out the legal paperwork for a non-monogamous person who has passed away.
So can you give some examples of, sorry.
It's okay. I
Finish your
can
thought.
certainly try it. So one thing that could happen would be someone who is non-monogamous passes away without having any sort of legal framework in place. So they pass away without having written a will or a living will or having an estate plan. And that can be incredibly challenging because if there are no directives in place, the next the legal next of kin will be the people who will handle all of the deceased assets, debts, and even their body and what they want done with it for a funeral service if they choose to have one. And this also applies to medical directives as well. And it can be very challenging if a non-monogamous person, might have any number of partners who are loving, caring, and physically there or emotionally there in whatever fashion, but then if there aren't any directives in place and the legal right goes back to the person's next of kin, who is usually biological, and that can happen in cases where people are estranged from each other, and it can prove incredibly challenging. um, one example of this was actually on a TV show that I watched yesterday, ironically. It was the spoiler alert for anyone who watches New Amsterdam and hasn't gotten to season 3 yet. Maybe don't listen for the next few minutes. It involves a polyamorous quad who end up in the hospital after one of the partners becomes suddenly ill, and then they realize when there is a challenging medical procedure to be undertaken that none of the partners are the next of kin, and then they have to find and contact the next of kin who is not on good terms with the partners, and then eventually gets resolved. But it is heartbreaking to think about if someone's loved ones don't have the legal right to be there for them or there for their body afterwards in the event of a death.
So you mentioned a few things, wills, living wills, and estate plans. So can you talk a little bit about what each of those things are and how they differ, and then what special considerations there might be for non-monogamous folks?
So generally, a living will is a will that someone has completed while they're still alive and has directives for what they want to be done with, themselves, their body, their assets, their debts, their children, their pets, everything. And that generally covers the legal basis um, for what should happen if they become incapacitated. And it just kind of sets up the framework for, even if this person or these people in a non-monogamous, however many partners are involved, even if they're not the next of kin, they would still have the right legally at that point to be basically in a legal term viewed as the next of kin or the most important decision making people. And then generally a will is like not a living will, just sort of a regular will is usually what people have in place for the legal documentation in the event of their in the event of their death. And one thing that needs to be taken into consideration is that a lot of people don't really think about changing or updating the wills. So as a queer trans person, I was very grateful that, for example, my parents, when I had my name change and my gender change, they thought, oh, right, we'd better update Kayden in the will because at that point I actually hadn't thought of it. So I'm very glad that they did because otherwise it would have meant, some tough conversations explaining to strangers about gender identity. And you'd like to avoid those conversations if at all possible. I'm happy to say my parents are still alive, but thank you, mom and dad. And a and the estate plan is also, it's usually tied in with a will. It's kind of what people want to happen to their estate, essentially, if there is one, after they've passed away. So like their property, their, again, pets, any dependents they might have, including children. But also sometimes if they're involved in elder care, there could be dependents who are not children. And that actually can prove very challenging as well, because sometimes if a person passes away and there are children involved, like the children might be closest to a non-monogamous partner who's not listed as being their eventual guardian, and that can be very traumatic and very challenging for all parties involved. And the children could end up being looked after by someone that they have virtually no relationship to, as opposed to people in their lives who actually know them and care about them and love them. And even for non-monogamous people, that's a very important thing to consider. Because I'm sure we've all heard stories of someone passing away and then the children end up getting sent to, foster care, a distant acquaintance or blood relative who they really don't know, and tragically, people who do love and care about them, who, in this case, in this context, might be any number of non-monogamous partners of the deceased, they wouldn't have any legal footing to stand on unless there was a will and an estate plan and everything in place.
Now, how binding when it comes to kids? Because so I grew up in the U.S. and my mother was a family law attorney there for many years, and my recollection there is that wills are not really legally binding when it comes to children, because children, the decision making is made based on the welfare of the child. And so if there is a family member, say, who disputes the will, or just if the state decides that the kids are better off somewhere else, they can kind of do what they want. The state can do what it wants, regardless of what's in the will. So can you speak to that? Like, how does, and also in Canada, which may be different. I mean, I know you can say in your will and your estate plan, like, what you want to have happen to your kids, but can that be disputed? And
I mean, I should say I'm not a lawyer.
Right.
As far as I know, and in the province of Ontario, because Canada has all the provinces and territories, and all of these laws, by the way, differ in every province and territory.
Yeah.
So funerary law is generally done by each individual province and territory. It's not a federal decision, which again can be very complicated. And, for example, having spent some time in Quebec doing funeral service school in French versus funeral service school in English in Toronto, even the laws surrounding children and dependents and estate planning and how much, for example, money or assets might go to children or spouses or any next of kin, it differs wildly between province to province. And in terms of, I'm sure in terms of legal documentation regarding children and who would have the right to bring up the children and take guardianship of the children afterwards, I'm sure that whoever's involved could contest the will. Like, I'm sure if there were lawyers who were willing and able to contest the legal documentation, then that would be one way to go. That said, I do believe that the wills and estate plans regarding children are more legally binding than perhaps what you indicated as pertains to the state.
Okay.
I couldn't find anything disputing that. I mean, I could be wrong, but I feel like it could either, if it were disputed, it could either be a really good thing for the children and the other people involved, or it could be a really bad thing for the children and other people involved.
Yeah.
So I don't know, and it's a very complicated question when it comes to non-monogamy in particular. It also depends, because people can have partners who are not geographically close. They could have a very important partner in their life who happens to live in another city, another country, another continent, and that also presents all sorts of challenges when it comes to even finding out about a person's death or trying to be involved in the legal affairs, including involving children, because sometimes partners in other geographical locations might not even find out about the death until long after it's happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that could be the same if people were, emotionally close in the same city, but it does prove to be very logistically complicated.
Yeah.
I don't think that was an exact answer to your question. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, I think probably if you are non-monogamous and you have kids, you just need to get, if you can, get a lawyer involved in your will and estate planning, because there's so many
I would
questions
agree.
and peculiarities. So
I mean, I have to say that as far as I know, the people I know that I'm close to who are non-monogamous and do have children, the majority of them, I believe, are married
mhm,
to at least one partner, and as far as I know, they've all taken directives to figure out what would happen to their children in the
mhm,
event of themselves and or their spouse passing away. But it can it can just prove very, very legally complicated.
yeah.
And I
So
know sometimes in some cases, children might know that their parents are non-monogamous, but not be sure how many other people know, or
mm,
they might not know, and there's a lot of secrets and truths that come out after a death has occurred, and sometimes they're easy to navigate, and other times they're not.
mm, yeah. Um, Speaking of which, it's a good transition into the second half of the book, which is dealing with the death after it has occurred. So, what are some examples of some things that might come up that are peculiar to a death in a, a non-monogamous situation, a death in a polycule?
So, I mean, one thing is even trying to figure out what to do and who to contact in the event
Mm-hmm.
of a death. A lot of the non-monogamous people that I've known, understandably, have been much more focused on life and joy and trying to live their lives to the fullest. And quite a few of them haven't, even from a personal standpoint, quite a few of them have never discussed, like some of them live in other countries than their next of kin, and some of them didn't have anyone to put down on an insurance paper because none of their relatives lived in the same continent, and it can be very challenging when all the people you're closest to are not seen by the funeral industry as legally acceptable. I mean, when I was in funeral school, I had a professor try to convince me that trans people didn't exist, let alone non-monogamy.
Yeah. I think you
Um,
tell that story in this book, don't you?
I do a little bit.
Yeah.
It was an interesting experience to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, in terms of conversations to have after a person has passed away, any partners would need to figure out both kind of who to contact, because they would have to contact a medical practitioner in terms of like either like a doctor or a nurse practitioner to assess the cause of death. And of course, it depends on where and when that happened. Like there are different procedures to follow for if it's at a home or if it's in a hospital, and the have to figure out, is there a will in place? Is there an estate plan? Kind of who to contact next. And this also involves, friends, because for a lot of us, our chosen families are in whatever capacity are as important to us as blood next of kin. And, you know, if I think back to some of the people that I've known, like some of them I didn't even know their spouse's last names or let alone phone numbers or email addresses. Like if anything had happened to them, I would have had no idea who to contact.
Yeah.
So I think in some ways it's probably quite important to know the important, know at least know the existence of the important people in your people's lives, and
Yeah, I
maybe
was just thinking, like, it kind of makes sense for every polycule to have just a good old-fashioned phone tree, right?
I was just thinking, I was like, everyone basically just needs a phone tree.
Mm-hmm.
And these aren't the most joyful or pleasant conversations to have. I mean, if people are thinking about relationships, they don't necessarily think about who do I call if someone passes away.
Mm-hmm.
But it is important in the event of an emergency or crisis happening. Um, and to think. So one other thing too, that's sort of more particular to non-monogamy is that they might have, like, people might have to explain to strangers and professionals not necessarily the intricacies of all of their relationships, but if they said, like, my metamor passed away, they'd have to explain what a metamor was and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, why some of these relationships are consensually non-monogamous and how that differs from monogamous cheating.
Mm-hmm.
All these conversations that are known and, you know, I'm sure many of us have gone through, but you don't necessarily want to try to figure this out during a crisis because often during a crisis, like, people's ability to not only grieve but even process anything during that time can be very unexpected. Like sometimes people lose their ability to, like, they lose some of their senses temporarily. Like people have a hard time hearing or seeing when they're in shock. Um, and people who have passed away like visibly look different from people who are still alive. So it's actually very common for living people to look at a deceased person and go, that's not my person.
Mm-hmm.
Even if they are, it's just that in that moment they don't recognize them.
Wow.
And that can be, all of that can be very challenging. I'm just trying to think. So, for partners who aren't involved in the everyday aspects of their partner's lives, that can also be quite a challenge because it would mean that someone who is involved in the everyday aspects, who might be taking care of funeral arrangements or the death care arrangements rather, they would have to know of, they would have to know about the partner and ideally how to contact them so that they could inform them about what had happened to their partner who had passed
Mm-hmm.
away. Like again, we just need a phone tree. Um,
Right.
and
Yeah.
sometimes people who are geographically close by sort of feel compelled and occasionally coerced into taking responsibility for kind of death care arrangements when they might not be equipped or even want to do it, but they feel they should because they're close by.
Mm-hmm.
And that can also be very challenging for people who might live farther away, but they might want to be the person who's arranging everything. And
Mm-hmm.
because we all live in different cities, different countries, sometimes different continents, and sometimes there's time differences, and that can prove very challenging. There's also the issue of, for anyone who's spiritual, there are certain faiths where the deceased bodies, in terms of their spiritual beliefs, like the living believe that the deceased bodies need to be returned to the earth as fast as possible. So, like Islam and Judaism, it's very important to get the deceased back into the earth
Mm-hmm.
as quickly as possible. So that often means that even in monogamous contexts, that people who would like to attend death care ceremonies don't have the time to get there. And that can be very challenging. And then if you throw that in with non-monogamy, it becomes exponentially challenging in terms of who to contact, when to contact them, how to proceed with death care arrangement, who's taking responsibility for it, who's legally allowed to or supposed to take responsibility.
It
And
seems.
oh, sorry.
Sorry, were you done, or can I interject?
No, you can interject, please.
Well, it seems to me like, I mean, so many of these things are not necessarily unique to non-monogamy, but just, like maybe inherent to modern life. Like I was remembering after my divorce, and I had to start changing my emergency contacts everywhere, and I started changing to a local friend, and then who had agreed to do it, but then I was like, well, what does this actually mean that you're my emergency contact? So then I had a group meeting with my 3 local emergency contacts who were all friends, and we were like, well, what are we supposed to do? Like, we sort of had to sort out. I started Googling, what does an emergency contact do? And that led to a lot of these questions, like, advanced directives and contact lists. And, if you're in a coma, who do we call? And if you need care, who can we call to help with your care? And I have a list of homework that I've not yet done yet.
I mean, same, honestly. I mean, same. And one thing I think that people can do in the event of a crisis is just sort of ask the people who are grieving and dealing with it what they actually need, and listen to the response, because sometimes it's, I want to not be alone, and sometimes it's, I want to be alone. And bringing food by can be really helpful. One thing that non-monogamous people might have to face that monogamous people wouldn't have to is discrimination within the medical and funeral industries. And even if not discrimination, then education, which can be, it's another burden to take on, and it's another task. And a lot of people don't really have the spoons or desire to do that, especially when they fear judgment. And that's why sort of having advanced directives and the legal side of it worked out, or even just talking about, these complicated topics with partners, like, does a partner have any allergies? Do they have any illnesses that I may need to be aware of?
Yeah.
Like most people don't, I know myself, I don't really want to be an educator in a time of crisis. I can barely even serve myself at that point. And it might not be the most romantic or sexy of an idea to sort of go over all of these things with partners or metamours early into the relationship. I actually did that with my spouse, though. We, on our about 3rd date, we went to a bar and just jokingly, and then seriously asked each other a list of like 150 questions. So we knew that we were kind of on the same page with things going forward, so we weren't laboring under any misapprehensions. Ideally, I'm where I've sort of painted some of the funeral industry, and I'm not ideal light. I do believe a lot of funeral directors are incredibly caring and compassionate and would do their best. Same with medical staff too, to look after those in their care. When I was in school, my colleagues were the most caring and compassionate people, prepared to work 80-hour weeks just to make sure that other people got care. That said, sometimes their hands are tied in terms of legal procedures, and that can be devastating for people involved. I think one thing that people should be aware of too is just the aspect of grieving relationships that don't exist in monogamous life can be very challenging. So, like, you can definitely suffer the grief of losing a metamor, even with a breakup, and a partner in a breakup, let alone if someone passes away. Like, I think there is a grief process that we do go through, and even if it's not talked about very much. And it's certainly challenging to explain to other people how close some of those relationships can be, and why you're sad about losing them, or how you're trying to support your partner in grieving the loss of their metamor, of your metamor, rather.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or their metamor sometimes. And it's very complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, grief also exists in many forms. Like, some people, laugh at funerals, cry at weddings. Some internalize everything. Some externalize everything.
Mm-hmm.
Some only cry. Some can't cry.
Mm-hmm.
Like, sometimes it comes out as anger. Sometimes people seem fine until, 3 months down the line, they suddenly aren't. And that, I feel like all these circumstances can lend themselves to what's known as like complicated grief or absent grief in the funeral industry. So
Mm-hmm.
absent is when it's like you feel like they should be grieving, but it's just not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes like it comes out as delayed grief later on, where sometimes it could come out 5 years down the line. And
Yeah.
I think if you're sort of trauma informed and self-aware, I know many of us have been through counseling as well. Good therapist is always helpful. That can be like the after effects of that can be mitigated, but it's definitely a process that people might not understand, and it could be challenging to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that as long as, as much as I would want people to celebrate life and enjoy the relationships that they have, I do think it's important that they think about the other aspects of what could happen as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm really curious about your master's thesis research. It's not the subject of this book, but you mentioned it, and you mentioned it a couple times in the book, and it sounds like fascinating. So I'm curious, one, how you chose it as a topic, and two, just, I mean, we don't have all the time, but I would just love to hear a little bit more about it, what you learned.
I just before I do that, I should say also that like I went through a whole process in writing this book, just wondering if I was even, non-monogamous enough
Mm.
to be certified in writing this book. It's like when you're asking if you're queer enough, you're trans enough, or you're good enough.
Yeah.
And
I'm revising more than two right now for the second edition, and I've had thoughts like that too. It's like, I'm not currently in anything that most people would recognize as a relationship. Should I be writing this? But here I am.
I think the answer to that would be yes, because you've had the lived experience and
Right.
you are self-aware and have already written the book already. So
Yeah. Yeah,
like,
that's
who
true.
better than yourself to revise it?
Yeah, 10 years more experience. So
That's it.
from when it was first written. Yeah.
One thing I'm actually realizing too is that, yeah, in terms of non-monogamy and relationships, there are definitely people where I've definitely dated and met people where, in the context of the lives that they live, they don't, and especially as a trans person, people don't always live using their legal names,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be an extra step when it comes to death care arrangements,
Yeah.
and it can be a very challenging and often homophobic and transphobic kind of minefield to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
I remember watching a short Spanish film, I believe, about a trans person who ends up being well, the family ends up wanting to bury her in her former gender and former clothing, and her friends sneak into the funeral home and switch the outfits and everything before the last ceremony takes place, which is personally what I would want if I were in that situation. But sometimes, depending on which communities you're in as well, especially in the kink community, people don't always use their legal names often, and it's an extra facet when it comes to trying to figure out death care. And when I was in Scotland writing my master's degree, I actually, at that point, didn't even realize I was trans and had only started coming out as queer. I think it took escaping to a different continent to actually act on being queer. Not that I couldn't have done it in Canada, but I somehow didn't feel able to. And I was fascinated by the topic of child death because when I was lucky enough to visit a cemetery in France, in Paris, Père Lachaise Cemetery, the children's graves were covered in statues and poems, and like sometimes even the gravestones and tombstones were carved into like teddy bear shapes, like anything that people could do to commemorate the living child was basically done with those graves. And when I was in Scotland, some of the newer graves had that. Like I was very interested to see that you could actually have a tombstone that was shaped like a teddy bear for a child. Because to my knowledge in Canada, most cemeteries still won't. Like they wouldn't have allowed that. Funeral laws can be very, very different from country to country. Like
that's not something I ever would have thought of. Limitations on the shapes of headstones.
Well, in Canada, a lot of cemeteries, because they're running out of space, the plot is actually leased now, not owned. So people are leasing plots for 99 years.
Wow.
It's there's a lot of, I don't know what's going to happen when they hit the 100th year, but it's complicated. And when I was in Scotland, the older gravestones that I found, some of them didn't even have the names on them. They would only have the initials and the date of death. And then sometimes they didn't even have that. I remember seeing one tombstone that just said, James Brown and his 6 children. And I found it fascinating that that differed so much. And if it was people's, financial situations where they couldn't afford a stonemason to inscribe more than that on a tombstone, if they could afford a tombstone at all, or if they just wanted to grieve privately as opposed to publicly. And when I was studying, I really did want to study child death in Victorian Scotland, but it was fascinating how much pushback I got about it from academics. Because the majority of the people I was with just said, oh, well, there's all these resources for England and the UK, meaning focused on England. And I kept being told time and time again, like, no one's done this on Scotland, or there just aren't the resources, you should just give up and choose something else. Which I refused to do, obviously. But it was fascinating that I got that level of not only disinterest, but almost antagonism from academics. And it was also kind of tragic reading about the difference in class and classism regarding grief. Because in the 19th century, a lot of wealthier people who were more literate, so they were in general. So, of course, their records are the ones that survive, as opposed to the many people who might have been illiterate at the time, whose records might survive in oral storytelling but wouldn't have been transcribed onto paper. And so many wealthy people just believed that the poor didn't grieve or didn't grieve properly.
Wow.
Because they didn't have the lavish, you know, funerals that cost the equivalent of like £20,000 today.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of poor people would be grieving, and you could like see it in these photos and in these references to their lack of voice and their body language. But a lot of them just had to get up and go to work the next day. And I feel like that can also be similar to kind of non-monogamy, where it feels like many of us might do our grieving in a solitary way or do it and have to hide it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm lucky in that many of my coworkers at work, not all of them, but many of them, know that I'm non-monogamous. And even if they might not agree with it personally, they still respect me as a person, and they would respect my emotions and my grief should anything happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that not everyone's as lucky as I am in that respect, and that's kind of heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was my decision for doing my master's thesis.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really, I was thinking about doing a PhD afterwards, but it would have cost more money and more time. And at that point, as much as I love both my parents, who are my my mom was an academic, and my dad is well, both of them kind of teach and write, but I realized I didn't want to be an academic, and I just wanted to help
Right.
the everyday person. And
Right.
not everyone has access to education or wants it. And I do believe that as much as perhaps I would have had an amazing time in academia, I do think that I probably help people more in my job answering the phone these days when
Mm-hmm.
people might confide in me that they're not doing so well, and I try to help as much as I can before giving them
Yeah.
the help they actually called in to talk about.
Yeah.
Um, but I would just say that I hope that people value the people who are in their lives, and
Mm-hmm.
also maybe make advance directives
Yeah.
for what happens if the worst happens.
Yeah.
I know it's not, I don't know, it's not the most pleasant topic to talk about at times. A lot of people understandably are unnerved and
Mm-hmm.
disturbed by death and grief.
But it's also, I think, an act of care, right, for the people who are going to survive you
I
to
think it is. I would agree with
make
that.
those plans in advance.
In some ways, I would consider it one of the biggest acts of care,
Mm-hmm.
because you know that
Yeah.
you're even if you're not around, you might be helping someone else that you love or care about deeply when they're going through one of the worst points in their lives.
Mm.
And I think that's really valid and really touching.
Yeah. That's a good way of thinking about it.
I
Yeah.
mean, I say that. I'm sure that the next time a crisis happens in my life, I'm not going to be as eloquent, if I can even say as eloquent,
Mm-hmm.
this, in this way. I will
Yeah.
100% just be freaking out, unsure of what to do.
Yeah. So we should be signing off fairly soon, but is there anything else that you want to say about the book or anything that I haven't asked that you wish I'd asked?
One thing that I don't think I really touched on that also impacts kind of death, but also, and a number of people have said would make for another amazing book that would fit into the series, but I think, as far as I know, no one's written it. It's just the topic of non-monogamy and money,
Mm-hmm.
because one thing that one way that that ties into funeral arrangements and non-monogamy or death care is sometimes partners might, or people just might like to attend the or help with the death care arrangements for one of their partners or metamors or someone else in their life, and they can't financially afford it.
Mm-hmm.
or they might feel compelled to pay for someone who can't afford it, and that could create its own issue if they're the wealthier person. And I think that can also cause a vast amount of grief and turmoil as well. And I mean, it does in relationships. Like, I know a lot of relationships end because of disputes about money and how to manage it and spending and everything. Um, and short of counseling, I do think it's something that people should talk about. But I know some actually caused. It's been a source of strife in at least one of my past relationships, where one partner, who was a nesting partner, and I were, we were poor enough that we were struggling and eating out of food banks with the rising cost of living and inflation. And then another partner was one of the top paid people in the company and did not understand, like, understood but didn't fully understand what our situation was like. And or I know one partner has spent a lot of time visiting. Like, one partner might spend a lot of time visiting another partner in another province or another country, but then people might eventually have to talk about, is that financially sustainable and what is an alternative? And I believe that can also be fascinating, but also potentially worrying, troublesome.
I would love to publish a book on. I would love to publish a book on non-monogamy and money. So if you're watching this and you are qualified to write such a book, please pitch me.
I think Non-Monogamy and Money would be a great book.
Yeah, I think there could be written from a number of different perspectives too.
And I know people go through different periods in their life where they might have more or less money, and that can definitely affect them as a person, let alone their relationships. So, something to think about. Are there any questions that you have for me, Eve?
I think that's all my questions. So, do you want to tell folks where people can find you online? Do you have a blog or an Instagram or anything like that you?
At the moment, I have Instagram and Facebook. I have author pages on both those platforms.
Great.
I'm in the process of figuring out websites, but website maintenance is proving more tricky than I had anticipated.
Okay.
As a newbie with a website.
Yeah. Again, the book is Non-Monogamy and Death. Officially pubs in a week, but you should be able to get it now. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Eve. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to publish this. I hope you have a good night.
Okay, you too.
Thank you.